Folks, let's start. So I sense some energy in this room. I think that's terrific. I've been taking care of my son all weekend, and so I bring no energy. Should 12-year-olds be allowed to stay up till 11 o'clock at night? I cooked for him a bunch of stuff his mother left in the fridge, and he didn't like my cooking. But we watched the Bourne Identity movies all weekend, and so we did one manly thing. So if you ever need to bond with your preteen son, I recommend the Bourne Identity. And he told me I do not remind him of Jason Bourne. And so we know what I'm not. I don't know what I am. Well, I do know what I am, but it's not anything I'm proud of. So folks, a lot of stuff is appearing on our webpage, and I want to make sure you guys know how to read, which is a necessary condition for succeeding in this course, and maybe in this life. So of course we're going to do Lecture 3 today, and Lecture 3 today is great. You may actually learn something. We will see. A bunch of readings have popped up, and I'm hoping you folks have some interest in reading. If it's an optional reading, you don't have to read it. If you're illiterate or if you got other things to do, don't read it. But if you're a serious nerd, if you expect to have a future, read it. There's a reason I put it there. It's to make you smarter. So the first reading, optional reading on externalities, is about me. Some guy wrote about me, and I like that, so I thought you should read it. This reading, so I don't even know what it is, unless I wrote it. Of course, last class we were talking about externalities. Externalities was that steel factory. Oh, yes. So this is my famous new paper with Sichi. So China faces many environmental problems right now, which are an unintended consequence of its economic growth. With my close friend Sichi Zheng of Tsinghua University, we've written a very important paper that's going to generate a heck of a lot of citations that was just published. And so for those of you interested in China, or any of you from China, a couple in the front row. That's randomly distributed. I like that. It's a very interesting question. If your economy grows at 8% a year, is happiness rising at 8% per year? Or is an unintended consequence of economic growth, if it's factories, if there's coal-fired power plants, is an unintended consequence of economic growth more pollution? If the leaders of a country recognize that pollution is rising and that people are unhappy about that, can government change? Can you bend the pollution curve? Can government do anything to improve pollution? It's going to be our theme over the lectures this week. And of course, we answered that the answer is yes. But you guys can read this, and I teach other courses at UCLA on this subject, which you won't be able to enroll for. It's funny. Folks, I also gave you a good right-wing article by my good friend Casey Mulligan. If I have any young conservatives in this room, which I guess the answer is no, Casey Mulligan wrote something very controversial for the Wall Street Journal that came out the other day. And for those of you who are liberal but open-minded intellectuals, I highly recommend reading it. But this is an optional reading, which of course you will skip because you have other things to do. But you can impress the professor if you actually sit down and read it. That's something I'm willing to talk about in office hour. We're now here in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday. There was a piece about the unintended consequences of the Endangered Species Act for local economic development. I encourage you to read this piece. It is required. Let's talk about these three. And of course, folks, these might pop up on final exams, and they're meant to make you smarter. And to see the links, oh, this one's good. This is a hilarious story. How many of you read the Ohio Wheeling News Register? I didn't even know it existed. Is anyone from Ohio? Who is that? Drew Brees is handsome. The aluminum factories in Ohio create a lot of pollution, but they want lower electricity prices. The CEO, the chairman of the board of some company called Ormet, is demanding an electricity price reduction from Ohio's electric utilities, or he's going to shut down his factory. Folks, what trade-off do the people of Ohio face? This is almost like blackmail. Do any of you negotiate with hostage takers? So there is a factory creating good jobs for middle-class people in the middle. Has anyone from Hannibal? Any of you see Silence of the Lambs? What is Hannibal, Ohio? If you do bad in this course, I'll sentence you there. I don't even know where it is, and I don't care where it is. But there's an aluminum plant that is creating jobs in Ohio. Folks, what else is the aluminum plant producing? Pollution. pollution. A byproduct of aluminum smelting is pollution. If you don't do well in school, you'll end up living next to one of these. Folks, who deserves a price discount? I know you all want to pay a tuition of zero. I know I want to make $1 million for these bad lectures. What should the aluminum factory pay for electricity? They'd love to pay zero, but is it in the Constitution? Did Thomas Jefferson write into the U.S. Constitution that Osmet, Ormet gets to pay zero for electricity? Folks, what's going on? Have any of you read it already? It's been there for a couple of days. Just revealed you don't care. Life is about investment. You want me to be nice to you? You invest in my class. What choice do the people of Ohio face? Life is about trade-offs. Trying to show you a real-world trade-off. Make the course come alive, not just draw supply and demand curves. Okay, you read it. I don't have time to teach this. There's something fascinating here. If it doesn't fascinate you, switch classes. Got 2 more readings for you. There's a reading in today's New York Times that economic growth is over, that the U.S. economy is never going to grow at 3% again. I hope this guy is wrong, but he's the chief economist at one of the world's leading investment banks. Stephen King is the lead economist at HSBC, centered in London. They also have a big office in Hong Kong and New York. He wrote a very pessimistic article about that the U.S. economy isn't going to grow anymore. It means no jobs for you guys. It's actually kind of an interesting article that you should think about. I'm trying to think about why he's wrong, and I'd like to write a piece countering his piece, but he makes a bunch of logical arguments that I'm actually having trouble refuting. And I'd be interested in your views on this. It's a very pessimistic piece. I'm a very optimistic man about your future. But I think that this is an important piece to read, and there's already 170 Schlemmerts who's already commented. Let's see what you guys think. Do you guys care about your future? Does anyone understand if there's no economic growth, there's no jobs? So it's sort of interesting whether he's right, and what does economics have to say? It's mildly interesting. And then the final required piece is about Lake Tahoe. Has anyone been to beautiful Keep Lake Tahoe blue? There is a piece today in the New York Times on Lake Tahoe. If you guys had been good students, you would have read it already and said, Professor, I want to talk about it. Nobody emailed me this morning. Does everyone see this as blue? These are as blue as my beautiful eyes. Folks, what trade-offs do we face with Lake Tahoe? Does anyone own any real estate around it? Do I have any future rich people I'm going to suck up to for money? I thought so. Folks, what's the trade-off we face with Lake Tahoe? This is an article about trade-offs. You can still drop this class. That's a trade-off if I'm boring you that much. I can write on the board 10 times, what is avocado's number? 10 times 2 to the 23rd? 2 times 10 to the 23rd? Is that knowledge? You, what's your answer, avocado?
So if you're like going to this area, you want to appreciate the beauty, so spending time in a resort or something, you get to appreciate that, but the trade-off is having resorts like on the edge of Lake Tahoe polluted. So it takes
He's terrific. You should be teaching this class. Did anyone hear what he just said? The environmentalists, and I'm one of them, wants to keep this pristine. Folks, one way to keep this pristine is to let no men and women near it, not let your children go poop in it. But what would be a consequence of letting nobody near Lake Tahoe? What would we lose? The joy of using it. With many environmental assets, whether it's the Grand Canyon or Lake Tahoe, we face this trade-off of how do we appreciate Mother Nature without trampling Mother Nature. So folks, Goldilocks wanted the porridge not too hot and not too cold. Is there a King Solomon in the room who's smart enough? So we know that zero development around the lake is too little development. Can we agree to that? Can we agree that infinite development around the lake is too much development? Can we agree to that? Now that we've bounded the solution, how do we find the optimal amount of economic development around this lake? How do we begin to do that as if we were a consulting firm? Somebody say something smart. I'm not in a bad mood. I just wanted to wake everyone up. But folks, can we agree this is interesting? What could an environmental economist do here in this battle? Who's battling? Which interest groups are battling over Lake Tahoe? Go for it, young man.
Developers and like the locals that have lived there for a long time.
So developers versus locals, it's almost like tag team wrestling. Locals and environmentalists are battling the developers. Folks, why do the locals want to not let any more barbarians into the gate? Do the locals already have homes there? Does your home have value if there's no way to build more housing? Can anyone say monopolist in a sentence? Professor, monopoly is when there's one seller of a product. Whew, you know the definition, but you know nothing. If you own land around a beautiful asset for which there are no close substitutes and no one else can build a house near it because of liberal environmentalists, are you rich or poor? You're rich, 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 baby. Why do developers want to build new homes around this? Because developers make money taking land and adding value. Folks, who loses? Who loses if no more housing or hotels can be built around Lake Tahoe? Not a trick question. Use your intuition, as I say to my son. Don't yawn at me. Get hit with a cane. You. Tourists. She just said developers and tourists. Folks, how many of you have never been to Lake Tahoe? If there's only one hotel there, what price are you going to be charged a night? A very high price, because it's going to be priced at the opportunity cost. They may charge $400 a night. If there is a fair bit of development through competition, that price could drop to $250 a night, and you guys would have more consumer surplus, as you could have access to Lake Tahoe at a lower price. Liberal environmentalists will counter, in your allowing, Kahn, in allowing the little people to visit Lake Tahoe, you're going to destroy Lake Tahoe. So what's your solution, King Solomon? Is anyone smart enough in this room to figure out the win-win? We all want win-wins, which is a free lunch. How do you achieve the win-win of allowing economic development without turning this into another piss stream? I'm being videotaped. I would use worse words if I wasn't. What are you going to do? Yes, Kelsey.
Maybe consult like biologists.
Nice. She said bring in some experts. What might a biologist or environmental scientist say? Can we mitigate? The win-win would be to have economic development around the lake without the negative externality of turning this beautiful blue lake gray. What might a biologist be able to do? These guys don't, this is not Harry Potter. Did anyone read the article about Harry Potter in yesterday's Sunday magazine that he regrets having been Harry Potter? That Daniel whoever? It's interesting. I don't regret my fame. That was a joke. I am not as famous as him, but not as ugly either. Folks, what could a biologist do for us? Yes.
Maybe determine like.
Speak up, they can't hear you.
Determine like a percentage of the land that can be developed.
Nice. So she's saying that there's certain biological realities that there might, if we could identify certain critical threshold points, there might be amounts of pollution. For example, the New York Times article talks about when cars drive on the road, runoff from the cars ends up in the water, polluting it. It's possible that there's some threshold such that if you don't exceed that, that the water will stay blue. If that's the case, that begins to tell you how an ecologist would think about how to balance economic activity with preserving Lake Tahoe to achieve the win-win. Yes? They can't hear you.
Making sure that there's green development and zero waste development.
Making sure that there's green development and zero waste. Quite possible. So these are smart ideas. And this is the way I want you guys thinking. There's a question of whose job that would be. Would any individual property owner have an incentive to be really clean and green around the lake? The free rider problem that we talked about last class would still be here. Does everyone remember the free rider problem of the dude walking through UCLA and throwing the litter on the ground? Well, he would not do this in his living room. He would do this on the quad because he thinks he's small. His garbage is inconsequential. But if everybody thinks that way, you end up with a non-blue Lake Tahoe. Folks, now let's start today's lecture, and this is going to be hard. It's time for everyone to suffer. So we're in chapter 3 of the book, and the book starts to pick up speed. You can either do economics or you can talk about economics, and we are doing nothing. Chapter 3. So last class, we motivated why even a rabid libertarian should support having government and environmental regulation. In the real world we live in, there's public property. Folks, is Lake Tahoe public property? Is it owned by the Koch brothers? You some sort of conspiracist? Does Goldman Sachs own Lake Tahoe? No. Lake Tahoe is public property. The UCLA campus is public property. When you have public property and when you have capitalist actors of firms and households, you can often have this nasty tragedy of the commons. Like in last class when we had the steel factory polluting the air. Or what you guys did, control yourselves, in homework 1. when there was the water polluter hurting the children downstream. Did any of you cry in homework 1? Our job is not to cry. Our job is to diagnose a problem and solve it. We're like dentists. We aspire to be dentists. After class, put homework 1 right there. In the presence of public property, and folks, public goods are things like bald eagles, Lake Tahoe. These are public goods. When I enjoy Lake Tahoe, that does not preclude your ability to enjoy Lake Tahoe. When I eat a cheeseburger, that means you can't have it. Because of these two conditions, there's a reason for government to step up and intervene in free markets. So folks, here is a very, very, very tough question that we need to spend 3 minutes on. What is good public policy? What does the word good mean? And let's do an easy case that you will all understand. And I will speak slowly. We at UCLA need to choose between having chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream. We need to make a public policy decision. If we were all identical, why is the problem very easy? If we all were identical and we had to choose between chocolate and vanilla, my yawning friends, why would public policy be very easy? Yes? We'd all choose the same thing. So folks, how would the righteous social scientist go about finding out whether you prefer chocolate or vanilla? You're all identical. And if you take a course in statistics, how many people would I need to sample? 1! Say, hey, handsome, chocolate or vanilla? Would he have the right incentives to reveal the truth to me? Yes, because I'm going to do what he tells me to do. Will everyone cheer his decision? Yes! Let me hear a roar. Yes. Now let's bring in diversity. You all love diversity. I love diversity. What's the challenge of diversity in public policy? And without making this about race or income and get everyone hot and bothered, let's assume that there's meat lovers and there's vegetarians. And we have to choose between meat, chicken, or tofu. As a society, we're going to make one choice, people. How many for the meat? How many for the tofu? What's good public policy in this economy? I'm going to sit down and listen to your silly answers. Did anyone see what just happened? In a diverse society where we have to make one choice, what's good public policy? Do I have any public policy major or minor? She's my former student. She doesn't get to speak anymore. I know she knows. How do we think about what's good public policy when we differ in our priorities? Are you going to say, well, we need to kill people, choose one person and clone him? Is that your vision for what we're going to do next? What are we going to do? I know he knows. Got 2 smart people. You, young lady. So this is the tyranny of the majority. What if we killed the Jews? There's a question. So she said, let's make the majority happy. Let's be careful, folks. While that's attractive on one level, that can lead to very scary things for minority groups, which has happened throughout history. So on some level, she's right. What's another answer out there? I want you to think about what you say. You should be able to anticipate what I'm going to say and then say something different based on what you know I'm going to say back. What is good public policy?
Provide alternatives, but not too many alternatives.
So he is embracing the menu. And one of the points we're going to make is when you decentralize power across cities, when you allow different cities or different school districts to offer different combinations of taxes and services, you can let heterogeneous people vote with their feet. So if you want vegetarian options, you go to the UCLA vegetarian cafeteria. If you don't like smokers, you don't live in the smoking lounge. He's telling a story when we celebrate diversity, we need to open up different options. Folks, at the Gap, do they only sell size 37 waist pants? Have you noticed that different folks have different waists? And so they offer different products? Rather than you getting fat to wear my 37 pants and my inability to put a thigh in your pants? That was funny. Let's go back up to the top. The way an economist defines good public policy, as I do in chapter 3, so I see you didn't read it. You were just tested. Be careful what you say to the professor. Is if the winners win more than the losers lose. That's a Hicksian Pareto improvement. I'll repeat that again. Folks, is a cure for cancer good public policy? Who is hurt by a cure for cancer? I hope none of you have cancer, but with probability 1, someone in this room will. Who is hurt by a cure for cancer?
All the drug companies.
The drug companies and the oncologists. What are they going to do? They're going to become economists or something. But because the winners, because there are so many victims of cancer who would be willing to pay so much money for a cure, the winners from a cure for cancer win more than the losers lose. And thus it would be good public policy to have a cure for cancer. Economists define good public policy as those policies where the winners win more than the losers lose. Does anyone hear what I said? Because if you insisted that good public policies are only those where everyone is made better off, would we have any public policy? Would there be any Clean Air Act? Would there be any Obamacare? Would there be any subsidies for UCLA students? My taxes went up to pay for this. I'm not sure what you're learning. That was a half joke. That's why we have exams, so I can know what you actually have learned. That's not a joke. Read the book. A fundamental issue in modern economics is how do we evaluate what public policies were effective? If I punch you, you bleed. Cause and effect are obvious. How, based on what you read in chapters 2 and 3, how do we know which public policies, how do we know that a policy is effective? So name a public policy. So President Obama is debating containment of the civil war in Syria right now. Somebody name an environmental policy. How would we know whether the Clean Air Act has been effective at reducing pollution? It's a standard exam question I ask every year. Folks say the craziest stuff. Can we all agree that it's a slightly interesting question to ask? The Clean Air Act imposes costs on our economy. The benefit is that it's supposed to clean up air. What evidence would you need to convince yourself that the Clean Air Act has been effective? How many of you are pre-med? How do we know when a drug is effective? How do we know when a professor is effective? What does it mean to make a difference? All these words are synonyms of effective. Someone answer the question. I heard you say when you see a pollution measure, and then I heard nothing. That's a B+ answer. Who wants to bring that home?
When there's less illnesses being caused by pollution?
These are all interesting. What are we missing here?
Measured over a period of time.
So I agree. So there's truth to all three things you guys said. Nobody used the words control group in a sentence. I'll give you an example. Suppose that I weighed you right now. And suppose that I send you out to watch some Star Wars movies. And then 5 years from now, I weigh you again. And I see that you're fatter. Watching the Star Wars movies raised your weight? I had your weight at the baseline. You watched the Star Wars movies. And you came back a little fatter with your freshman 15. With my little brain, I see I've done a before-after comparison, and you've gotten fatter after watching Star Wars. Ergo, Star Wars causes fatness. What's the fallacy in that logic, which all of you just committed? I'm going to just walk like Yoda until I hear something smart. You, big guy. You, sir.
It's a lurking variable. Because causation isn't the fact you watch the movie, but it's probably
And how would we know that? What would a control group give us? What would be a control group in my stupid example?
someone who
Didn't watch the movies. Thank you. To claim that something causes something, you need to answer the counterfactual. What would have been the outcome had that treatment not occurred? It's obvious that Star Wars doesn't cause weight gain, because over 5 years, just everyone gets fatter. The same people, had they not watched Star Wars, would still have gotten fatter, and that proves that Star Wars didn't cause their fatness. So to argue that the Clean Air Act is effective, it is not sufficient to show that air quality has improved, because we don't know whether the same air quality improvement would have occurred in the absence of the policy. Folks, we're not able to clone. Why do biologists clone creatures? Do I have anyone who's a biology major? Why do these guys clone frogs? They're just like torturing animals. These are sort of like 11-year-olds in perpetuity. Why do these scientists clone animals? To have a control group. Does anyone understand what I'm saying? What's hard and fascinating about my field is I can't clone you. If I could, I would clone you and make you sit in this class 24 hours a day until you finally understand what I'm saying. When you don't have clones, What do you use as a control group? If California introduces radical legislation but no other state does, how do we know if that legislation was effective? Folks, isn't that kind of interesting? When you don't have a control group, how do you do statistical science? And of course, the answer we're going to talk about throughout this course is you do the best you can. You try to use Oregon for California. You try to find something close, even though it's not perfect, and you talk about the error. If the Clean Air Act improves air quality, we then need to know, do people actually value an improvement in air quality? Let me explain. Suppose that the US economy is comprised of Wonder Women and Supermen. Is the Clean Air Act valuable in such a nation? The Clean Air Act could be very effective at reducing pollution, but if pollution causes no impact on sickness, remember we introduced last class the sickness production function. If Wonder Woman and Superman have a slope of 0, then they don't care at all about the improvement because they weren't damaged by the pollution. We got to think, and we got a lot of tough stuff ahead of us. So I can now define good environmental policy. Good environmental policy would be if you have a susceptible population. The opposite of Superman. If you have people who love Lake Tahoe in the population, if there is a public policy that strongly improves local public goods, it cleans up air pollution, it preserves Lake Tahoe, in that case, it's much more likely that the public policy will offer large benefits to the society. We haven't talked about the cost side, and we'll talk about the costs of regulation throughout these lectures. An example. This is from urban public policy. Should Los Angeles hire 10,000 more policemen? Folks, this is a standard question that urban and crime economists talk about all the time. A causal question is, how much would this investment reduce crime? It's a very hard question to answer. Let me crack a half joke that I don't think is in the slides. No. Folks, correlation is not causation. For a naive researcher who doesn't know economics, when you correlate across cities, if you made a graph of the number of cops in cities and the amount of crime, would it be negatively or positively correlated? If you made a graph with cops on one axis and crime on the other, and you can make it per capita, I don't care about the scale of the city. You're going to have a positive correlation. Cities with more cops have more crime. Did anyone understand what I just said? LA has a lot of crime and a lot of cops. So, if we took that statement seriously, should we hire more cops? What would be an unintended consequence of hiring more cops if that correlation represents a causal effect? More crime. So let me get this right. It's going to cost money to hire these cops, and then they're going to kill some more people. So for the researcher who doesn't understand causality, why is it the case that cities with more cops have more crime? Not you. You. So there's a chicken and egg issue, is what she said. Is it the case that cops reduce crime, or do those cities with more crime hire more cops? Folks, isn't that kind of interesting? I'll say that again. Life is about what's called simultaneity bias. You're starting to think as an intellectual when you understand chicken and egg issues. For those of you who know econometrics, this is the instrumental variables problem. And for those of you who don't, why? There's a fascinating question that there's a positive correlation in the cross-section between the number of cops a city has and the amount of crime it has. A fundamental question is do cities hire more cops when they have more crime? And when you hire more cops, does that actually reduce the crime? Folks, how could we ever then, if we face that bias in the data, how could you ever answer this question? I will talk to students about that in office hour. But that is a fundamental question. When you have reverse causality, how do you answer these questions? Folks, but let's go back to what we're supposed to do. In the context of what's good public policy, you would need to answer how much do different people value crime reduction? Rich people versus poor people, people of different ethnicities. Folks, what would be an unintended consequence of hiring 10,000 more cops? This course really stinks that bad. Yes? Well, she said using tax money. Of course there's no free lunch. You'd have to pay these guys. Has anyone participated in stop and frisk? Has anyone followed the New York City election where African Americans are tired of being viewed as guilty till proven innocent? Do any of you have a friend who's ever been pulled over driving while black? These are interesting questions. I do not mean to say that all police engage in this, but there is this activity within the police force. The New York City election was, this de Blasio won the election because of his opposition to stop and frisk and to concerns that certain groups are targeted in New York City by the police. I'm not going to discuss this too much. I see you don't care. But there's very interesting issues of civil liberties. If you have a large police state, there are benefits and costs of all actions, including listening to these lectures. Folks, who will pay for these cops? If each of these guys make $100,000 a year, and if they can retire at age 50 on full pension, and if with their health insurance, if they have Cadillac plans, who pays this? The taxpayers, your parents. And so there's a question of who bears those costs and who gets the benefits. Sir?
It's interesting also because a lot of times when you create a policy where you hire 10,000 more cops, the crime does get reduced, and then they say, oh, no crime, let's get rid of the cops, and then it comes back.
So that is interesting. So he's telling a cyclical story of if the cops do have a causal effect on reducing crime, would the future mayor then reduce the crime force and this would cycle? It's interesting. But this is an example of how an economist thinks about what's good public policy. Folks, I now want to talk about the motivation of government officials. So let's start with me. Why do I give good lectures? I think I give pretty good ones. Has anyone taken a course with a bad professor at UCLA? Do professors enjoy giving bad lectures? Then why do they give a bad one? They just are innately bad at talking. They can't speak English. They mumble. What determines whether you give a good lecture as a professor? What's their motivation? There was that old Sprite commercial. What's my motivation? I'll let you think about that. I want you to think about in this slide, since I have 25 slides to do, we need to think about the motivations of government officials to do their jobs. Whether you're President Obama, whether you're President Putin in Russia, whether you're Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, there's an old debate among political scientists and economists. There's one school of thought that sort of is with Jeremy Bentham. There's this utopianism that says that government self-selects super people, just sort of Mother Teresa's. Folks, would Mother Teresa take a bribe as a government official? Would she only focus on rich people? Does anyone remember Mother Teresa? Mother Teresa was a wonderful woman, better person than me. I won't see her in heaven since I'm heading to hell. Just a wonderful person who did the right thing and was a moral example to evil people like me about how one could carry one's life. There is a very cynical view from the University of Chicago, which I'm a member of, that, well, let's just jump to this one because these are cliches. Folks, the way the University of Chicago economists view government officials is that they're normal people. President Obama is a very smart man, as is Eric Garcetti, as is Jerry Brown. But these folks need to be incentivized to pursue the public's interest. Folks, by the public's interest, I mean even in a diverse society of what do we all agree upon, of green skies, safe streets, good schools, that we need to incentivize politicians to do their job. Is this a controversial statement to folks? For example, what do you know about what Eric Garcetti did today? Has Eric Garcetti's name crossed your mind today? While you were brushing your teeth, did it cross your mind, what is Eric Garcetti doing for UCLA today? Did anyone think that? So you're not so weird. How does the public know anything about its leader's actions? What if Eric Garcetti woke up this morning and took a $10 million bribe from some business to allow it to do as it pleases? Would you ever know this? How would you know this? Stop mumbling. What did you say? What does the media know? They just write about Kobe Bryant. Kobe's knees hurting. Kobe's ankles hurting. 35, too many miles. Where's Dwight? Does the media write about Eric Garcetti's day-to-day activity? How does the media know? Just got a bunch of bloggers typing random stuff. Saw Madonna at the whatever. Folks, this is called the principal agent problem. A principal agent, for the economics majors in the room, have you seen these words? These are usually only discussed in PhD classes. Let me describe 3 principal agent problems. Suppose you own shares in Facebook You want Mark Zuckerberg to be working very hard for you. You are the principal in that case. You own shares of Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg works for you as the boss of Facebook. Folks, under what circumstances would he have no incentive to work hard and just shirk and be lazy? So I've got no future business people in the room. So we've established what you're not doing in this life. When will bosses just kick back and play golf? Yes? Yes, when there's no incentives, no stock options, no review process. If you naively hold Facebook shares thinking the Zuck is just a god, but you pay him a fixed salary, you don't monitor him, he's going to shirk, 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 and just play golf. You should see me putt. I've got jittery hands. I'm not a good putter. You can always take my money. Folks, another principal agent issue is professors at UCLA. If we don't have teaching ratings, the principal is your parents. They don't know how hard the faculty are working in the classroom. They have no ability to monitor us. When the agents have private information about how hard they're working for the principal, when you know that it's hard for your shareholders, for those who own the corporation to monitor you, that encourages normal people to kick back and drink a beer and take it easy. So how do we, with this logic, there's also a principal agent problem in the case of government officials. The way we solve this problem is by monitoring government officials. How does the public monitor government officials? So folks, what information can we know in the case of the environment? So in the case of the environment, let's just do air pollution. What data are available that you could know to decide whether the Environmental Protection Agency is doing a good job? Be a good exam question. Monday morning. I only have the front rows working for me. Yes?
How about if you wanted to pollution tax?
So she said, Professor, there's an objective reality that for every city in every year, you could collect data on ambient air pollution, like PM10, PM2.5. And if you see suspiciously high levels of pollution, that suggests that some source, like a factory, is emitting a lot. And if government takes no action against that factory, that's evidence that government is shirking. So folks, the internet and information technology. Folks, what about Twitter? What does Twitter do in terms of creating accountability? How many of you tweet? My gosh. How many of you, well, you use your cell phones for something. Clearly so there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal today that young people don't use Twitter anymore, but I forgot what it said. There's Tumblr, Reddit, something or other. Thanks. If everybody used Twitter, if there was suspicious smoke around your house, what would you do? Some of you might tweet about that. Folks, what data pattern does that create for someone who knows big data? Of course, I'm talking about your future. There's going to be jobs in this. You all want to work at an aluminum plant? What many folks are doing right now is collecting geographic densities of Twitter spikes. And if they all mention the word pollution, what does that say to you? The way information works is if a bunch of people who live on the east side of LA start tweeting that there's a funny smell, some reporter at the LA Times is going to go investigate that, and then there's going to be a story and an investigation. That's how you create accountability. Folks, before there was social media, was any of this possible? Were any of you going to pick up a telephone and call the LA Times and say, I've got a breaking story? Twitter makes it very low cost for you to send out a signal. Those who know basic statistics can aggregate that information and make a map of that. Does anyone understand what I'm saying? There's going to be lots of money to be made on this. What information don't we have about government officials? So my claim is that the internet, in China, this is a major issue. So folks, I'll tell one more story since you guys are starting to bore me. When I gave a speech in Manila 2 years ago, I had breakfast with a leading Chinese official who told me the first thing he does each morning as a Chinese environmental official is check the microblogs for what people are chatting about. And if certain keywords pop up in certain geographical places, he will send his environmental police to investigate. That's how you create accountability. If a professor gets a reputation for doing a terrible job, then the dean starts showing up in your classes to listen. But it's cheaper to do what he does rather than to sit for an hour through a bad lecture. Folks, what information is not available to government officials? So we discussed last time a steel factory that was polluting. There was an $8 cost per ton of steel produced, and the government immediately imposed an $8 tax. What assumption was I making, my yawning friends? I can still drop this class. It's the greatness of being me. I could just cancel the whole thing. What's your answer? What assumption were we making?
You can clearly measure that cost, which is not realistic.
We were assuming that the government was immediately aware that the factory was polluting and knew all those ingredients that we introduced last time. But what if the pollution is latent? What if the pollution doesn't have an effect on health for 20 years? In that case, how do you hold government officials responsible who have already died for actions that occurred on their watch? So you have to think through the lag structure for when pollution manifests itself. If there's a latency between cause and effect, it makes it very difficult to monitor officials. Who is paying attention? Folks, a point here. A big theme in my life's work, Norden has expired. A big theme in my life's work is that as people become more educated, the percentage of the US population who has graduated from college continues to rise. Environmentalism rises with educational attainment. As the population becomes more educated, what will an educated populace demand from the media? Let me flip this around. If all of us just had an 8th grade education like my grandfather, would we want long articles about lead factories? When my grandfather was a young man, he just wanted to read about boxing. There's sort of just being interested in movie stars and sports. If you have a less educated anti-intellectual crew, the news is not going to, there's going to be no New York Times. The LA Times is kind of stupid with its articles about Kobe and movie actresses. You need a sophisticated public for the media to hire the expensive journalists to cover these issues. So a benefit of having an educated public who cares about environmental issues is that creates an incentive for the LA Times to actually cover these issues. And if the LA Times covers these issues, government officials know they're being monitored and will be more likely to do their job. So folks, we're going to be doing some calculus soon, since I see you guys are bored. I wrote a well-known paper on this topic of salience. So I wrote a paper arguing the following, that there's a silver lining of environmental disasters. Chernobyl in Russia, the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster in Pennsylvania, the British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska in 1989. Folks, when an environmental disaster occurs, why do environmentalists secretly cheer? That would be a good exam question. In 4 sentences, explain.
Because the public is finally paying attention to it.
So where was the public before the disaster? Couldn't there be nuclear radiation? Couldn't there be oil spills? Couldn't there be dead creatures? What is it about us that we ignored this until the event? So she's correct. Continue. Pull the pen out of your mouth. What point are you making?
I mean, basically, before then, there was no media coverage, so the public wasn't even aware of any of these issues. But now that there's huge disasters going on, the public will demand policy changes.
So let's talk about this a little. So she's saying we're a creature of the media? So Homer Simpson is just thinking about Springfield, Chernobyl occurs, and there's widespread nuclear radiation, and he now opposes nuclear power plants? Does that cause and effect make sense to folks? What just happened? If the media said, decapitate your bald economics professors, would you do so? Are you just pawns of Madison Avenue and of messages? Love your neighbor, kill, kill. When does the media change your behavior? They can't hear you.
About Chernobyl, a lot of people weren't affected by the factory to begin with, but when it blew up, it affected both Belarus and Ukraine. And so a lot of people personally felt the effects.
But it had an impact in the United States. So she's talking about its impact on Europe, and I can show you readings on the radiation path. Folks, when is an event shocking? when the media is talking about it. There's a social multiplier effect, whether it's Miley Cyrus dancing around, whether it's a crazy professor. If no one covers the event, then nothing has happened. There's a very interesting media effect. So folks, in my paper, which I will post to the webpage for anyone who wants to read it, I document that the New York Times coverage of these issues spiked very high, and then the New York Times covered the issue less and less as time passed. Why? Why does the media stop paying attention as time passes? At my funeral, there'll be world discussion of it, and then 3 days later, it'll be as if I never existed. How did the issue pass? What happens with time? Time heals all wounds, but what happens with time? Had enough of you, young men. Yes?
More interesting things happen.
Yes! So there's a small window, people, where people are on edge and thinking about it. Folks, what do liberal environmentalists in the Congress do during that small window? Kelsey? They push for radical policies. Does anyone understand what I'm saying? There was a Seinfeld episode called The Upper Hand, where it was a Seinfeld episode about relationships, of who has the upper hand in the relationship. Usually the Greens are on the defensive against big oil and big coal because big oil and big coal have all the money and make the campaign contributions to these representatives. But after disasters, the liberal environmentalists have a brief window to do some radical things. The public is energized, the media is covering it, people are angry, people want solutions, and the Congress steps up. So this is called the salience. So we often get environmental policy change after a disaster. Two friends of mine wrote the following paper. Do I give their names? No, of course not. Folks, let me read to you this quote, and you're not responsible for this, but this is very interesting for those of you who are interested in urban economic history. Over the period 1899 to 1929 in the United States, the authors Kahn and Rotella document that when a city suffered a mortality shock from dirty water, that the city subsequently sharply increased its expenditure on cleaning up the water. In 69 of 98 cases, city expenditure on the water supply increased by more than one standard deviation after one of these shocks. So folks, city mayors respond to environmental disasters by doing something, by spending money. And so I'm very interested in what is a catalyst of new environmental policies. And this, I'd be happy to speak to students about this topic. But an open question is, when, for any environmental issue, when does government get involved? And does it take a disaster for government to get involved? And we can talk about that some more privately. Folks, I now want, this is boring, there's 4 levels of government to think about. Throughout this course, we're going to be talking about 4 levels of government. There's going to be global government, like a global carbon tax. There's going to be national policies, like the Clean Air Act. There's going to be state-level policies, like California's AB 32. And there's going to be local environmental policy, like Los Angeles road pricing, Los Angeles water pollution policies. We need to think through different levels of governance. Do we want to do this? I need to pick up speed, but I would ask you to read this on your own. Mike Bloomberg got a reputation in New York City that was well-deserved for building a green city. And I would have you think about what was it about New York City that he pursued that agenda. I want to spend more time on this point. If an innovative mayor like Mike Bloomberg in New York City passes public policies that are effective in New York City, when would a Beijing or Chicago adopt those same public policies? If an idea is a good one and it proves to work in one city, what is your intuition of when it can be exported to other cities? Who's a trendsetter? If the captain of the football team starts wearing a nose earring, does that raise the probability that you do? I've been thinking of wearing one. If New York City shows that an idea works, when might Chicago or Beijing or Cairo adopt the same idea? Do I have any optimists about how good ideas spread? I'll let you think about that. Let's do some math. So we need to do pollution permit markets. For years, economists have been battling lawyers that pollution permit markets are the right way to reduce externalities from factories. Government has unique power to introduce pollution permit markets, and this is going to be one of the last things we do today, and let's do it in detail. But folks, this would be a decent exam question. I'd have the study groups think about social learning. You guys didn't give me anything smart, so I can't give you anything smart. Let's do some math. This is what real economists do. So there's 50 factories in a city. 25 are old and 25 are new. Each of the factories, the key point is that the two factories differ with respect to their cost of reducing pollution. Folks, this is very important. This Q is not the same Q as last class. Last class, Q was the amount of tons of steel produced. In this class, we're talking about how much does it cost your firm to reduce your pollution by Q tons. Here, measured in dollars, is the cost for the new firms. This is the cost for the new firms, and this is going to be the cost for the old firms. Folks, notice what this says. If one of the 25 firms reduces its emissions by 10 tons, 10 times 10 is 100, times 0.2 is 20, plus 10 is 30. It costs each of these firms $30 to reduce their emissions by 10 tons each. Understood? These firms have lower costs of abatement. If they reduce their pollution by 10 tons, oh, no, I screwed up. I got everything backwards. Well, I will double check my math. Let's double check this. 10 times 10 is 100, 50, 70. I wonder why I did it this way. All right, we may be heading for a disaster. If these turn out to be wrong, I will fix these. Let's set this up. Boy, that was bad. In the first case, I want us to do many of you care deeply about fairness. The math is going to work, but I don't like what I did. Folks, let's do case number 1, where we treat all firms equally. All firms are going to be asked to reduce their emissions by 10 tons each. Does everyone see I substitute for each of the new factories, I substitute the 10 in, and I get that they each reduce their pollution. To reduce their pollution by 10 will cost each of these firms $30. While for the old factories, for each of them to reduce their emissions by 10, let's double check that it's 70. Make sure I didn't make a mistake. Yes. For each of the old firms, it's 70. Note there's 25 new firms, so 25 times 30 is the total abatement cost for the new firms. And there's 25 old firms who each have to pay 70 to reduce their emissions by 10. When you do that, the total cost is $2,500. Folks, what's the problem with treating different people equally? I thought life is all about equality. I'm supposed to treat all of you equally. What's the problem with equality? Yes? So this is a different definition of fairness. I want us to focus on the information I've given you in the example. So he's saying, Professor, calculate the marginal cost for the two firms. And notice that this firm's marginal cost equals Q. Calculate a derivative of the cost function, get Q. Calculate the marginal cost for these guys, and it's 0.4 Q. Who has the lower marginal cost of abatement, the new firm or the old firm? The new firms. Who, according to the efficiency criteria, should do more abatement? The new firms. The pollution permit market's going to bring that about. Let me show you the end of the math. So folks, keep this number in mind. With your demand for equality in this life, it costs $2,500 to achieve the goal of, we've achieved a 500 unit reduction in pollution. Each of the 25 new firms and each of the 25 old firms have each reduced their pollution by 10 units. I'm going to show you that we can achieve the goal of the 500-ton total reduction in pollution at a lower cost than $2,500 if you are willing to leave your beloved equality. Here we go. And of course, folks, here's the geometry. The two types of firms differ with respect to their abatement costs. And that's what, there is a low-cost firm and there is a high-cost firm. And there's 25 of each of those. Now let's do the second case, and here's the harder case. If our goal was to minimize the cost of achieving a regulatory goal, folks, why would we want to achieve the regulatory goal at lowest possible cost? So we want to reduce pollution by 500 units. Why would we want to do it at the lowest possible cost? Any of you remember your excitement about isoquants and isocost lines? Was that the highlight of any economist's lives? Why would we want to why would we want to achieve a given pollution goal at the lowest possible cost? I know you know. Who else knows? I have 120 people in the room. I know. Folks, what's good about low cost? I know you know. Looking to the bleachers, yes. But let's say it differently. Folks, have you noticed that Republicans block commie liberal regulation? Have you noticed that we don't have a Congress right now? If we could achieve a pollution reduction at lower cost because you let the economists in, you didn't sleep, you actually thought, what would happen to our society? Would there be less hate between Democrats and Republicans? Yes. Republicans often oppose environmental regulation because they think it's inefficient, that these are well-meaning goals but done by folks who have never worked a day in their lives in the real world. And if you could convince these folks, these Republicans, that the goal could be achieved more cost-effectively at lower cost to businesses, they'd be more likely to support this. There are moderate Republicans. Environmental regulation supporters would have more political support if their goals could be achieved more cost-effectively. That's why cost minimization is good. You should not have slept through your economics lectures. Let's do it. The goal of the regulation is to reduce emissions by 500 tons, 25 times 10 plus 25 by 10. The marginal cost for each of the 25 new firms is 0.4 times Q. For those of you who remember your calculus, and I'm assuming all of you know calculus, take a derivative of the cost function, and that's the marginal cost function, bring the 2 over 0.4 times Q. Analogously, the marginal cost for the other firms is Q. The efficiency condition requires the following first order conditions. Folks, here's the key intuition for today's lecture. You have reached the cost minimizing point when you've equated the marginal cost of young firms of abating when that equals the marginal cost for old firms. Let me prove that to you by contradiction. Suppose it was the case that there was not an equal sign here, but a greater than sign. So suppose that for whatever we've set Q young and Q old equal to, that this side of the equation is less than this side of the equation. Have we minimized cost? No. You should ask these guys to do more of the activity because their marginal cost of abatement's lower. Now suppose there's a greater than sign here. Then these guys should do more. You've only achieved the cost minimizing point when the marginal cost is equal between the two. So I want to show you two equations and two unknowns. The efficiency condition is you should allocate the requirement to reduce pollution until the marginal cost for each type of firm is equalized. The second equation is that however much abatement the two firms do, it has to add up to the goal of 500. Folks, does everyone see there's two equations and two unknowns? We need to solve for how much abatement should the young firms do and how much abatement should the old firms do. We've got this equation and this equation. When you have linear equations with two equations and two unknowns, we can solve that. And what you end up with is that, remember the old example. Each firm, when we engaged in the fairness that you guys demanded, each firm abated by 10. In this case, the young firms raise their game and do 14.3, and the old fogey firms do less, 5.7. When you plug these numbers into the total cost equation, it costs this amount. You should double check my math, which is less than the original 2,500. By creating a pollution permit system, we're going to incentivize companies to equate their marginal cost of abatement in a way I'm about to show you. And this achieves the social goal of reducing pollution at the lowest possible cost. And that's the point of this slide. And you guys can study that on your own. I'm down to 10 minutes. Now, here's the issue with problem number 2. We have punished the low-cost firms. The low-cost firms, under the equality, were asked to reduce their emissions by 10 tons. We're asking the new low-cost firms to reduce by 14.3 tons. This is a very important point for the course. This creates very bad incentives for companies. You want to reward companies who are good at reducing their pollution. You don't want to punish them with higher costs when they're good at reducing their pollution. And that's what a pollution permit system does. It rewards those who are good at abating. So folks, here's the key slide. We're now going to do our first supply and demand graph for thinking about internalizing an externality by government getting involved. And let's do the first thing. So this is a usual supply and demand graph with one twist. On this axis are tons of pollution permits. This is aggregate tons. Q right here. On this axis, it's hard to read. It says the price per pollution permit. Folks, here's what I want you to think about. If we have no pollution permit market, what price do polluters effectively face? They face a price of 0 for pollution. Can we all agree that's too low? Here's the way the pollution permit market works. The government first sets the supply curve. Everybody say it together. The government sets the supply curve. That is a vertical supply curve, folks. It is not upward sloping. It's a vertical supply curve. Folks, why doesn't the government set the amount of permits at 0? Why doesn't it just solve the pollution problem? Who's going to freak out if it sets it at 0? Businesses are going to pay a fortune for these permits, and they're all going to move to Bangladesh. Is anyone with me? Why doesn't the government set the supply curve at infinity? What would be a consequence of that? The price would be 0, and the equilibrium price would be 0. So does everyone see that this demand curve, if you set the supply curve here, does everyone see that the equilibrium price would be 0? Is that going to have any incentive effect on polluter behavior if they now have to pay a price of 0? So sort of like Goldilocks, the government faces a very tough decision of how it sets the supply curve. It wants to incentivize the polluter to reduce her pollution, but doesn't want to set the price so high that the business shuts down. Is everyone with me? So the government now sets the supply curve. In any market, there's supply and demand. Those firms who want to produce will have to, and who pollute, will have to buy pollution permits. Folks, ignore this curve. This curve doesn't matter. Only focus on this green curve and on this curve. Where supply cuts demand is going to determine, at this price right here, does everyone see that aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, and that aggregate supply equals the cap? So this is called cap and trade. At this price, the government has capped the pollution permits at this level. Where the demand curve cuts the supply curve, sets the price. So folks, if you run an aluminum factory, you now have to pay this price per ton of carbon, per ton of pollution. How will this incentive affect your actions? For the environmentalists in the room, can they cheer this? What has government just done by introducing a pollution permit market? The government has introduced the pollution permit market. It's created a new commodity called pollution permits. And polluters can only release pollution if they have permits to cover that pollution. And this is the aggregate supply curve. This is the aggregate demand curve. This is the equilibrium price. This might be $20 per ton of pollution. Folks, somebody cheer this. What is the benefits of this? Yes?
So the new factories, if they can get more incentive to, they get more incentive to reduce their pollution and then sell their pollution permit to the old factories. And the old factories will buy it because it's cheaper to buy the permit than reducing the price.
That's an excellent answer. What she just said was the following. She said, Professor, if companies now face a price of let's go back to our example. If companies now face a $10 price, do we like that? If they now face a $10 price for reducing per ton that they have to pay if they release a ton of emissions, some companies will be able to cheaply reduce their pollution and they can sell permits they have, while others who can't cheaply reduce their pollution will have to buy permits. But folks, we skipped a step, and let me slow down. What jobs does this create for graduates from the UCLA Institute of the Environment? I know she knows. I'm going to turn to the middle of the class. You guys hate this class so much. The way you impress a professor is say something smart. Why do I teach you? Sunshine. If your business now has to pay $20 per ton of pollution, what do you do differently? I have no future business people in this room.
It would incentivize you to innovate new ways of doing things so you wouldn't have to pollute as much?
Yes. You might move to Bangladesh, but a less severe thing you might do would be to call the UCLA Institute of the Environment and say, I want a practicum team to come down here to take a look at our business operations. Folks, when I take 6 of you for a tour of this business, what are we going to see? Does this look like a green building to you? See this crap hole we're in? Look around. If we went to a factory, it would look just like this. There'd be buildings older than me, pipes full of crap. And they would look like this because they have faced a price of 0 for their pollution up to this point. When businesses face a positive price for pollution, they will be highly motivated to bring experts in for an environmental consultancy to take a look at whether the business is efficient. This isn't liberal environmentalism. You have added pollution to their costs of production, and this incentivizes them to bring in environmental consultants. These guys might update their lighting. They might change their technology they use in a number of industrial processes ways. And in that sense, the government's introducing the pollution permit market helps to mitigate the externality. Folks, let me ask another question. What does the area of this rectangle represent if these permits are auctioned rather than given away? Folks, what is the formula for the area of this rectangle? Do I have any young Terrence Towers? It's P times Q. In California, that's $20 billion. This is a lot of money, young people. If government collects an extra $20 billion by taxing pollution, what can government do, my young liberals? It can cut your parents' labor income tax, and they will have more money to give to you, more money to buy stuff. There's a whole literature in modern public finance of tax waste, not work. There's all sorts of distortionary effects. Many guys are drug dealers in part because you don't pay taxes on cash you make drug dealing. There's a whole black market economy because of our taxes. If we cut labor income taxes, all sorts of deadweight loss would vanish. The whole field of public finance focuses on what should we tax. If you taxed waste, you could still have a balanced budget by cutting taxes on work. So we actually have kind of a crazy tax system as we remove incentives to save and to work while we don't tax pollution. So many environmental economists are talking about shifting the tax code and moving to taxing pollution, allowing a double dividend of reducing taxes on productive activity like savings and working. I'd be happy to talk to folks about that. We got 3 more things to do. I'll have everyone out in 5 minutes. Folks, let me do an advanced topic with you, which will not be on the final exam, so everyone can take a nap. Martin Weitzman of Harvard made the following point 40 years ago. It's remarkable that 40 years have passed. Folks, this is right out of the book, but let's do it together. He wrote a paper called Prices versus Quantities. Does everyone remember that we had a single demand curve here? I now want you to think about the following experiment. Suppose that the government official does not know whether demand is going to be medium, high, or low for pollution permits. I'll say this again. Suppose that the government official is not Nostradamus. He doesn't know whether the demand is going to be medium for pollution permits, low, or high. Can everyone imagine 3 demand curves here? Folks, what's a reason why the demand for pollution permits could be high? It could be the case that our economy is booming. Folks, what's a reason why the demand curve could be surprisingly low? We could be in deep recession, or there could be some other explanation. Here was the brilliance of what Martin Weitzman said. Martin Weitzman said the following. He said, he may win a Nobel Prize for the following point. He may win it later this week for this. He said that a pollution permit market and a pollution tax have the same consequences if demand is perfectly predictable. Folks, watch this. If everyone take a look at the middle demand curve. If the middle demand curve is the demand curve for reducing for pollution permits, then a pollution tax of this amount has the same consequences of committing to a cap and trade market at this amount. So does everyone see that you get the same economic results if you commit to this pollution tax or if you commit to this cap on emissions? You get the same thing, this point right here. The brilliance of Weitzman's point was this. When we don't know where the demand curve is, prices and pollution permits have different effects. Let's do this case. Suppose the government commits to this tax. If demand is low, then this will be the amount of pollution created. While if demand is high, this will be the amount of pollution that's created. Under a pollution permit market, if demand is low, this will be the price. If demand is medium, this will be the price. And if demand is high, this will be the price. So the implications of both pollution taxes versus pollution permit markets, both of them create an incentive for the polluter to reduce her pollution, but they have different effects if the demand for pollution permits is unknown. But that's an advanced point that will not be on the exam. I want to end class with something that will be on the exam. I want 2 more minutes. And we're only going to do apples. Folks, does everyone remember my yelling and screaming that government has unintended consequences? We did the example of mandatory airbags and seatbelts and pedestrians getting killed, and all of you squealed and all of you were concerned. And that touched me. We were all younger then. So the intent of the pollution, so what's cut off at the top is as the intended and unintended consequences of government policy. So the intent of a pollution permit market is to reduce pollution. I want to end class with the unintended consequences of pesticides on apples. There is a chemical called alar, which I'm sure has negative effects on some people's health. Meryl Streep was one of the big folks arguing that it should be banned in use for apples. Folks, I'm talking about apples the fruit, not apples the computer. I want to draw 4 supply and demand curves for you to show how economists think, of how we're different than you folks, and how if this doesn't interest you, you can still substitute classes. So we start out at an initial equilibrium where supply and demand cross, where the original demand curve D1 crosses the original supply curve S1. Folks, if we ban alar, what impact does that have on the supply side? What do pesticides do? Do I have any biologists in the room? They kill bugs. And what do bugs do? They eat crops. What is the geometry of bugs? What do I do with the supply curve as we ban alar? It shifts the supply curve up. Folks, as apples become safer with less pesticide in them, what does that do to the demand curve? It increases the demand. Folks, what does basic economics predict will be the consequence of banning alar on the apple market? In minority communities, what was observed? Families substituted to junk food from apples. In poor and minority communities, it was documented not by right-wing social scientists, just by nutrition experts, that it was subsequently observed that as the price of apples went up, families substituted with their kids to junk food, whose prices had the relative prices had gotten relatively cheaper in terms of opportunity cost to eat potato chips rather than apples. So folks, that doesn't mean that this is bad public policy. What it means is that a good economist thinks about what's the elasticity of supply and demand and anticipates the unintended consequences. And there's a question of how many kids were at the margin, how many families did substitute from apples to potato chips as the price of apples went up. So it's the job of an economist to anticipate the unintended consequences. You slept through supply and demand classes, and now we're going to use this stuff. You will see the full power of the force. And that's you shouldn't have slept. And these tools, when properly taught, can make you something and make you a more important policy official. So we're going to start up next time with 3 more examples of this, and then we're going to talk, we're doing government next class. And I'll take your homework ones, please.